Well, good morning. This is my ride for today, my NC 700, and again going off to Exeter. Beautiful sunny day, and it looks like it's going to stay like this all day. But then again, it is the last day of June, so it should be nice. Okay, just a normal sunny June day in sunny Torquay, heading towards Exeter, and let's hope it stays like it. Well, a little bit about myself on this short video. I started riding a motorcycle back when I was 16. That's, should I say, legally on the road at the age of 16. But prior to that, there was a couple of other instances, shall we say, involving motorcycles that got me into Royal Enfields. Royal Enfields is my passion, and I've been involved with the Royal Enfield marque since 1967, and I enjoy the features of the bike, being as they are now very old-fashioned, of course, but that stuck with me, and being a British motorcycle, and being British stood for a lot in those days. It doesn't seem to stand for quite so much these days, as we've got hardly any motorcycle industry left. I'm talking in the motorcycle stakes, shall we say. But my first encounter, shall we say, with a Royal Enfield, my father had one, and he used to work nights at the time. I remember this distinctly. I must have been about 8 years old at the time, and with that he would come home from nights. He'd park the bike up in the orchard next door to our house. We lived in a council house in those days. Remember those? There don't seem to be too many of those around these days, but we lived in the top house of 15 on each side of the road, I believed, in Rectory Lane, Rock, near Kidderminster. That's in Worcestershire, England, if anyone's watching this from outside the country. But we lived there probably from the age of 4 till I was 10, and during that time my father, the only means of transport we had actually was a motorcycle. In those days, not many people had cars. Most people travelled on public transport, and I suppose we can consider ourselves lucky that he had a motorcycle. Anyway, it was an old Royal Enfield of some description, and probably something like a Model C, or even CO, or even a Model G. I don't think it'd be a Model G in those days. It would have been too new for my father, but there you go. Anyway, he came home from work on this one occasion. I was off school, or it was a Saturday or whatever when he came home. He parked the bike up as usual, leaning against an old cherry tree that had fallen in the orchard. And I was out there playing, as you do as a kid, and I climbed aboard the bike, sat on it, and then pressed a lever down, a pedal on the one side. That pedal went down nice and gently with my weight on it, being something like an 8-year-old. And as it went down a couple of times, and then next minute the engine started. And I firmly believe to this day that bike has never started so easily in its life before that. But anyway, the engine started. I jumped off the bike, frightened to death as to what was happening with it. My mother came out and shouted at me, as they did in those days. She promptly went indoors, got the old man up out of bed. He come down to turn the bike off, by which time it had stopped anyway, probably because the fuel was turned off. And he proceeded to give me a right beating. But that's what they did in those days, and I think that was that's what got me into motorcycles. And ever since then, it seems to be the Royal Enfield that's stuck in my brain as to the type of bike that I knew something about, possibly. At least I knew I could start one, even at the age of 8. And so from there on, my father had motorcycles. I remember it must have been about 1965 before he actually got a car, and that car was a minivan, and he bought that with the proceeds of winning the pools in those days. I remember he won £525, which to us was an absolute fortune, and that was enough to buy him a minivan that he could then travel to and from work, probably in a little more comfort, and do his odd jobs that he used to do. In those days he used to do hedge cutting, gardening, and anything else to make ends meet for the family. But that was that. I remember before he actually got his minivan, we'd moved to a place called Bewdley, again in Worcestershire, probably something like 10 miles away from where we lived previously. And because he used to have the motorcycle, we all used to travel on it. That's me, and my 2 sisters, and later my younger brother, and we used to travel on it. I think probably no more than 3 of us on the bike at the time, but in those days we could. I remember sitting there on the back of the bike with short trousers on, and my father riding the bike down the road at whatever speed the bike could muster, I suppose. Probably less a few mile an hour than its top speed, but I remember sitting on the back and fidgeting around because his trousers were flapping in the wind and hitting me on the shins, and it became very uncomfortable, stinging as he did, and he did nothing but shout at me to keep still on the back. I couldn't have been no more than about 3 or 4 stone at the time, so I don't know what effect it would have had on the handling on that little bike, but there you go. That was one instance. Another one when I didn't get to go on the bike, purely and simply because we were actually moving house. Now, as I think I was probably around 10 then, I knew we were moving house, of course. I didn't know the address of the new house. I just promptly went to school on the school bus. In those days we used to call it Ketley's Crates. Ketley was a coach operator in Stairport-on-Severn that ran the buses to and from the schools in the mornings and afternoons. And I went on Ketley's Crate to school, knowing my father was going to pick me up after school. And I also remember it being the end of term before the Christmas holiday, so it was in the middle of winter and cold, and I remember coming out of school, and because I was told to wait at the end of the road by the school for my father, by the little shop, and I promptly did so. But then I'd found something like a penny in my pocket. A penny in those days used to buy a few broken biscuits, so we used to go into the shop and ask if they got any broken biscuits. Biscuits were sold in tins. Well, they weren't sold in tins. They arrived to the shop in big tins, and then they dispensed them into smaller packets for the amount of biscuits that you wanted. And there were very often broken bits that they didn't really sell to proper customers, shall I say. But to us poorer children, they would give them away, or we could buy them for probably I wouldn't say a farthing in those days, that's a quarter of a penny. Farthings had gone out by then, but probably an halfpenny, half a penny. And with that I went into the shop to buy, or to see what there was to buy, and by the time I come out, my father was nowhere in sight, and apparently he'd been and gone. I never heard the motorbike, I never saw him or anything, so I stood around waiting, by which time one of the teachers came out of the school, probably the last one out, and asked me what I was doing, and I said, well, I'm waiting for my father to pick me up. And he said, well, can I give you a lift home? I said, well, I don't know where home is now, we've moved. So I think the joke is nowadays I should have looked at my sandwiches, they might have been wrapped up in a road map, but I didn't. So consequently, after consultation with the local police station, he took me up to the police station, and then they investigated to where we'd moved to, etc., and gave me a lift to the new house. So moving to a new area with all the kids looking as you move in, as they do, and I turned up in a police car. So that was a good start to our future residence in Bark Hill, Bewdley. There you go. We were there for another 4 or 5 years before we moved, but during that time I remember an incident with my father and his motorbike again a Royal Enfield. I don't know why he liked them, but as they were only made 15 miles away from where we lived anyway, so probably why he liked them, but there you go. And my father couldn't read and write in those days. He was not considered to be the brightest of individuals, and I had to read the manual. He came home with the manual for the bike. He came home with a set of, in those days again, it was cork clutch plates. They were plates that you actually fitted the corks into, little square corks, and I had to help him put the corks into it, or I did. I had to read the manual for him to tell him what to do, and we did it between us, and that's how I started to learn how to work on engines and Royal Enfields in general. So we put these corks in on the one night, and then the next night he come home, we decided that we would do the actual clutch, or he decided he needed to do the clutch when he came home. He was working normal day shifts by then, I suppose, because I remember it being in the evening, trying to get it done, rushing to get it done so he could go to work. Might have even been that night, I don't know, but probably the next morning. But anyway, we started the work on the clutch, we stripped it down, and this was all done in the kitchen, of course, because where we lived there was no garage, there was no space to work with limited tools, etc. Certainly not a workbench. So the work was done on the kitchen floor, and we just had to get on with it. Mind you, it was nice and warm, I suppose, but we did the clutch. I messed around with it and got it working. It felt right on the clutch lever, he said, which I know more about nowadays, of course. But he then promptly decided to kick the engine over to see if the clutch was biting, to making sure that it would work, because unlike modern machinery, if you kickstart them, you could pull the clutch in, and it wouldn't kick the engine over if you pulled the clutch in. So he didn't pull the clutch in. He just gave it one God Almighty kick to see if it was going to slip, and the engine decided to fire up and start. Well, it was only on a side stand. I don't think it was on a side stand, to be honest. I think it was on a block of wood, on the lino, on the surface, which is like linoleum, it's called. It's just a thin layer of plastic on the floor. And bearing in mind we hadn't got much money in the first place, but when he fired the engine up, the back wheel suddenly spun because it was in gear. The bike tried to lurch forward. Well, it couldn't really. I suppose he might have had his hand on the front brake, I don't know, but it didn't go forward. The back wheel spun, and it pushed the lino from underneath the rear wheel and bunched it up like waves in the sea, and ripping it to boot. So I got another bollocking for that. That was my fault, of course, because I was all of about 12 years old, and I suppose I should have known better than him. But there you go, that was another incident involving the Royal Enfield. When I became 16, one of the local lads much older than me. Off the cuff, I can't think of his name. He had a Royal Enfield Constellation for sale, and I decided that I would purchase it from him. So I saved all the money I could. It cost me £30. So I saved as much as I could. I started work at 15, so I was earning money by then for myself, and I needed transport to get to work. In fact, I was 15 then. I was at work at 15 because I hadn't got my license. So I bought this Royal Enfield Constellation, and I rode it home. It had got a set of clip-on bars on it, low-down handlebars, and I couldn't really ride it very well. I had to pull into a local garage workshop on the side of the road and ask if they could move the handlebars forward for me. They were pivoted on the fork stanchions in those days, and we had to move them forward so I could ride the bike without pinching my thumbs on the petrol tank. Anyway, I got the bike home, stripped it down, or did a lot. I don't remember exactly what work I did. I didn't strip the engine down, I know that, but I did cosmetic work. I remember taking dents out of the tank with an airline. I put an airline on the petrol tap exit and locked up the filler cap with a rag and pumped air into it, and it popped the dents out very neatly indeed, but as soon as I dropped the pressure, the dents went back in again. So I decided we would get the acetylene bottles. I was working in a factory in those days that made swings and seesaws, children's climbing frames, etc. So I was an apprentice, if you like, welder. That's rather a big word, being an apprentice. I just worked there, and I warmed up the area that the dent was in and blew the dent out again, and when I dropped the pressure it stayed out this time, so it looked half decent. But then I decided to, instead of painting the petrol tank, because we hadn't really got access to the spray cans of paint that we have nowadays, I decided to put a leather patch down the top of the tank, and it partially covered up the marks left by the heating of the acetylene torch, and that worked okay. That was good. But I worked on that bike and got it up and running, but obviously it was too big for me to ride, so I purchased a BSA Bantam, a Bantam Major. Now it came with leg shields in those days. I think it was a 1962, and it came with the leg shields and various other bits of metal that were not needed. So that was my ride. That's what I decided then to strip down and make it into. I don't suppose we were thinking of making it into the cafe racer that we all know today. We literally just stripped all the panels off, anything that wasn't needed on the bike. If it wasn't needed for propelling it along or stopping it, then we took it off. And we put I put aluminium mud guards on, and the smallest number plate I could make out of a piece of metal. We had no sort of plastics in those days. In fact, plastic was frowned upon because those Japanese bikes that were coming into the country were all plastic, and everybody dreaded that thought of having plastic on a bike, but there you go. We made things out of aluminium and little bits of metal because I was working in a factory that had access to all these things, and I got that bike on the road and took my test 4 days after my 16th birthday passed, and then put the Enfield on the road, but that wasn't so successful. The Enfield did nothing but break down. The things that had go wrong with it, the major things in those days was the magneto. There was no other way of creating a spark. The more modern machinery were going over to points and condenser, etc. But mine was stuck with a magneto, and the bike was off the road more than it was on. So I continued riding the Bantam for probably another 6 months to a year before I managed to get the Enfield up and running. Meanwhile, while the engine was out of commission, I stripped the whole bike down, and we had in the factory where I worked, we had a vat of acid. Can you believe? A vat of acid that would burn anything. It would strip anything off metal, and I decided to strip all the frame, all the metal parts down, cut off any of the brackets that weren't necessary, and then dip it in the acid bath, and then you clean it. It has to go through another process to clean all the acid off, of course. That was in like a degreasing tank that was just full of a mist. That mist is what cleaned the acid off, and then I ground away all the brackets. Well, I say ground away, we didn't have such things as angle grinders in those days, we had bench grinders, and holding the frame of a Royal Enfield for, as I was then, a 16 to 17 year old, it was quite a heavy object to hold against the grinder. So most of the brackets were filed away with a file, which was, I suppose, pretty hard work. But I needed to get rid of those brackets, I wanted to, so it was one of those things that you just do, no matter how long it takes you to do it. And then I got the lads in the spray shop. They used to paint all the metal for the swings and seesaws, climbing frames in those days were all metal. And they sprayed it all up nice black for me. And then I rebuilt the machine. I did the engine myself, getting it rebored. We had a local engineering shop, I suppose you'd call it, that would do all the work on the engine for me. But that took probably a good 12 months. But I got it up and running, and I used that bike for another 12 months, I suppose, until Castrol GTX. When Castrol GTX came out, I decided that I would put the best oil in my engine, and I was brainwashed into thinking Castrol GTX was the best oil. So I put that in, and probably after a period of time anyway, the engine decided to give way. The left-hand conrod decided to make an exit through the front of the crankcase, and that was the end of that engine. Having looked at it, stripped it down, I found out what the problem was. Prior to that, we used a mono-grade oil, a single grade, a straight 30 or a straight 40 for winter or summer use. And the 2050 was supposed to be a better oil that you could leave in all year round. I must admit it made it easier to actually kickstart. The engine turned over a bit easier. But in doing so, it had lots of additives in it that cleaned out the engine. And as it cleaned out the engine, all the residue congregated into the so-called oil filter, which wasn't the best anyway on the Enfield, and it decided to stop the engine oil getting through the crankshaft to the big ends, and the big end gave way, breaking the conrod. And that was the end of that engine and that bike. So I sold that one. Always then lusting after one of the lads. He had a Royal Enfield Interceptor, which was the bee's knees as far as I was concerned. It was the ultimate machine. I made inquiries about buying one because by this time it was 1969, the Mark II was coming out, and the Mark II was professed to be a much stronger engine. So I decided I would go for one of them, but it was over £500, which I hadn't got, and couldn't get what we call finance HP in those days. You could get it, but Royal Enfield weren't interested. The dealers had gone. There were no dealers that I could go to, and my local dealer, Harold Badham, there's a name to reckon with from the past. He was very, very synonymous with all types of motorcycles in his little workshop in Kidderminster. He advised me that the only way I could get one would be to go to the factory and actually pick one up by paying pound notes at the door, because they were selling them to America, where they knew they could sell them. They had a market that they were trying to fill over there. So I never got one. But Rocky, the lad called Rocky, John Badlam I think his name is, he'd actually got a Mark 1 and I wanted it, and I offered to buy it from him for extortionate amounts at the time, and something like £200 for a lot of money for such a bike, but he wouldn't sell, so I did buy a Triumph Bonneville from the Motorcycle Mart in Kidderminster. I always remember the guy's name, Mr. Turner. He was the owner of it at the time, and I bought this Triumph Bonneville. I had that for probably 12 months or more, and I remember it actually blew a piston. The gudgeon pin came out, and I still say to this day that there was a circlip missing from one of the pistons, and the Motorcycle Mart had actually rebuilt it, but I couldn't point any fingers, and that happened whilst going over the mountain up from Ramsey back over to Douglas on the Isle of Man TT week in 1969, that was 1970. So that was the end of the body. I had to rebuild that engine. So by which time I'd moved on to cars anyway. I'd purchased, as it was then, a Ford Pop, a little old Ford Pop, 1950 something, and I managed to swap that with my father's minivan because he'd had an accident in the minivan and dented the front. And he was quite happy to swap me for the minivan because the minivan had more street cred, plus the fact it was a van. You can get lots of motorbike parts in the back of a van compared to a Ford Pop. So I then went over to cars, but still keeping the Bonneville. Then we go through life as we do. I stripped the Bonnie down, rebuilt the engine, and I bought from the hub in Blackwell Street, Carl and Ann Robotham, who owned the hub in Blackwell Street. They'd got, I know it was registered as a 1972, and so it had just been built, and that was a Rickner Matisse. Now heaven knows why anybody should purchase a Matisse frame, and they put a Tiger 90 engine in it, can you believe? But anyway, he built it, the guy had built it, and within a month or so of riding it, decided it wasn't what he wanted and sold it to Carl. Carl said to me, "You still got that Bonnie engine?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he said, "Well, I'll buy it off you." And I said, "Well, what about you selling me the Matisse?" So I bought the Matisse from him and fitted the engine in. And that was a cracking bike with a Bonnie motor in, T120R. It was a lovely setup. The frame was everything you expected it to be, and the engine wasn't as quick as what everyone makes out, but there you go. Hey ho. So by the time 73 came around, I'd rebuilt that one, and then I found out that Rocky had actually blown up the Interceptor that he'd had for several years, which I hadn't seen for a few years because I was getting into girls in those days as opposed to motorcycles. And eventually I came across Rocky walking, and I gave him a lift, and he explained to me that he blew the engine up. And I said, "Well, I thought you were going to let me know if you wanted to sell